All right, good evening. On this third of four times we are meeting on Thursday, on Wednesday instead of on Tuesday. We'll get back to Tuesdays, Bezrat Hashem, beginning of April. And yeah, that's all I want to say. What we left off with last time, we were comparing the Talmud Bavli and Talmud Yerushalmi and the growth of each, the differences, some of the things they had in common, why, in fact, some of the topics are dealt with in Bavli are not in Yerushalmi, and why some things in Yerushalmi are not in Bavli. And also noted that the time period of the growth of the Talmud in Israel was much shorter. It was about 100, 150 years earlier that was finished. And I say finished in quotes because remember that was not, according to many, was not properly edited. And finished in Bavel, in Babylonia, approximately the year 500. And that's what we concluded with. What I'd like to do, when it comes to, actually, I want to make a comment first, because someone happened to ask me the question, and not here, not online, but just I happened to bump into someone ask me the question, and I want to address that for a minute. At this time period of history, in other words, after the destruction of Beit HaMikdash, and after that final gasp of the Mered Bar Kokhba, the Bar Kokhba revolt, until we get to approximately the year 700, 750, there aren't these episodes, like you're talking about, like the Spanish Inquisition, the Dreyfus Affair, the beginning of World War I. I mean, all these major events and Herzl and all these major. There's not right now. This is a growing period for the Jewish people in terms of finding themselves and refining themselves after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. There aren't. We could talk about personalities, but there are not a tremendous amount of events that we will focus on. We will soon, obviously. But right now, it's more about personalities and the results that come out of this time period. And what I just want to mention briefly, I just kind of touched on it last week or 2 weeks ago. We were talking about the Gemara, talking about all these different people in Bavel, Babylonia, and the different academies, Surah, Pumbedita, Neherda. We're going to talk tonight about Neherda a little bit more in depth. You'll see why. But just to mention very briefly, two personalities. And again, this is something that if you are interested, the internet is filled with information like you can find. I have Svarim and books that you're always welcome to borrow to read about some of the personalities that are in the Gemara. But I think it's important to note, and I'm not going to talk about them tonight, but it's important to note that many of these individuals, and I may have mentioned this before, had, quote, not last names, but appellations or describers of what their job was. They also worked. They did not sit day and night. Many of them did, sat and learned day and night, but many of them had regular jobs, and they were shoemakers, and they were blacksmiths, and they were carpenters, and they were part of society, the working society, in addition to learning Torah. The leaders of the academy, the Roshei Yeshiva, were, they call, there's a modern English word, it doesn't really apply, but I'll use it anyway. It's called frenemies. Friend is a combination of the words friends and enemies. They were never enemies, chas v'shalom, but they were diametrically opposed in many things they taught and their approach to life. And I think it's important to know that, just as an example, Rav and Shmuel, who were heads of two different academies, both, by the way, were born in Bavel. Rav was the head of Surah, the academy in Surah, and Shmuel in, in Neherda. Which again, I said I'm going to come back to Neherda. This is why I'm talking about both of them for a minute. Both of them were in charge of their respective communities, their academies of Torah learning. Both came from families of scholarship, so it was not like all of a sudden these people became these brilliant geniuses and started taking over. But they were leaders not only in the Torah world but also in communal work, in communal life as well. They had lots and lots and lots. I will say hundreds, there's probably thousands of contributions to Jewish law. We will see as we move through the time period of history how the growth of Jewish law also weaves its way into Jewish history. But what I do want to make a comment, and I've heard this many, many times over the years when teaching Gemara or teaching the history of the Gemara, and that is that these rabbis sat with a dartboard, and mythical, not an actual dartboard, and they said, okay, this is what I think my idea is going to be. Here's my decision. and they threw a dart at a board and say, well, Rav said this, so I'm going to say the opposite. And they always had these discussions and these arguments. And it's not true. Not true at all. They all stayed true to their perspective of Torah. So I'm making something up right now. Let's say, for example, Rav was always going to try to find the most stringent approach to something because he felt that the Jews needed to be reined in and they had to be toe the line as strict as possible. So when he would discuss it, and it's not true, I'm just making this up. So when he would discuss a halacha, he and Shmuel would try to come to, between two different academies, try to come to some general idea of what the halacha would be. And maybe Shmuel was much more lenient and he tried to find and make it easier for the people. So that's why it's very possible that they would have a different approach, where in a particular case, one would say he's allowed to do it, one would say he's not allowed to do. So again, this is across the board. You see this very often. If you were to, like when we talk about Shammai and Hillel, totally different personalities, and it was reflected in their Torah teachings as well. What I want to do, I want to talk about the latter part now of this time period of the Talmud in Bavel, and also talk about what happened to one of the major academies, i.e. Neherda. If you've never learned this part of history, so you're like maybe first hearing about these Torah centers in Babylonia, you may rightly picture they built these academies, people came to learn Torah. We talked a little bit about how that worked last week or 2 weeks ago. And then after X amount of time, X amount of years, I guess people just left and they would shut down. Some of them, yes, but some were a little bit more chaotic, which we'll talk about. But I want to show you something. Okay. This is from the Rambam. The Rambam has an introduction to the Yad HaChazakah. The Yad HaChazakah, which we'll learn about depth, which was the Rambam's magnum opus, which is major work. The Yad HaChazakah is the first true codification of law. You would say, wait a minute, the Mishnah codified law, but it didn't. It organized it, but it didn't make it code, what we call code, like the code of Jewish law. So in his introduction, the Rambam does what I did a few weeks ago in a couple of classes, which was to kind of trace the Torah from Har Sinai until his time, approximately year 1200, just rounding things off. But he now in the introduction is making a comment about this moment in history when the academies are spread throughout Babylonia. And he wants us to understand what was going on, because what was actually starting to happen was that you would think that the redaction, the writing down, the editing of the Talmud would kind of bring a spiritual uplifting to the people in Babylonia. But actually, that's not what happened. There was turmoil. There was a lot of turmoil in Babylonia at this time, some from the inside among the Jewish people themselves, some was brought about them from the outside, which we'll see. Either way, look, you can't ever approach Jewish history just from a factual basis and not take into account the idea of the spirituality of it. But I'm going to put that aside for a moment. But let's take a look. How does the Rambam describe this time period of history? After the time period of the conclusion, remember we said that two people, Ravina and Rav Ashi, were the final editors of the Gemara, which we're going to see tonight. It even was a little more than that later after them. And what happened? You think, wow, okay, we've got the Gemara. We got all these beautiful Gemaras now. Yes, they're all handwritten. We don't know about anything about a printing press for about another 1,000 years, but that's okay because we're good at handwriting. And you think that, wow, it's all going to keep everyone together. What happened? They started getting more and more distant. They started to spread out. Not only in Bavel, but to other countries, even to distant lands, to islands, to distant islands. As a result, says the Rambam, there were all kinds of disagreements and fractures within the world. What happened? You would think that right at the conclusion of the writing of the Talmud, that you would be at the top, the zenith of the growth of Torah. And he says now, as a result, what happened from all these splits and moves and what caused it, we'll see in a minute, the level of learning Torah started to go down. And they stopped going to learn in their yeshivot, into these Torah academies, Surah, Pumbedita, Nerda, Matamachasi, and all these places, by the thousands and the tens of thousands. They stopped, like they didn't go anymore. Doesn't mean none, but it went down in numbers. Ella, what would they do? Mitkabsim yechidim asridim. The individuals would start to get together. The people who survived all this, the migration of the Jews. Asher Hashem koreh b'chol ir v'ir b'chol medina u'medina. It's interesting because we're going to on Motzei Shabbat we're going to read the Megillat Esther and uses the expression ir v'ir medina u'medina, which is where the Rambam uses this from. V'oskim b'Torah, individual small groups in various cities. And they were able to understand the writings of the Chachamim, i.e. the Talmud. And they would know from the Gemara how to decide halacha. So we get this idea from the Rambam here. And by the way, if you're interested in seeing a really long, fascinating introduction to the growth of Torah Shebe'al Peh, the oral law, it's in the, like I say, the introduction to the Rambam's Yad HaChazakah. If you can't find it, let me know and you're interested. I'll send you a link and you can read it online in English. You can read it in Hebrew, French, Russian, and German, I think. It's in all kinds of languages that I've seen. But it turns out that this time period, I'm going to take this off here for a minute, that this time period of the conclusion of the Talmud becomes a very tumultuous, dark time for the Jews, again, both because of domestic problems and external factors. Around the same time, what's happening is the Islam is starting to have its early days. But Islam doesn't really start until only numbers are approximate year 7, about the year 700. We're only in the year approximately 500, but there's still early talk about what's going to happen. Eventually, the Persian Empire will be taken over. It's already causing some problems. Obviously, Muhammad's not around yet, and we don't hear from him. We will learn about him. Internally, there were a lot of controversies with one specific office, and that was the office of the exilarch, which we talked about, the Reish Galuta, the one who was the head of considered the head of the diaspora Jews. It caused all kinds of other problems. We're going to see in a minute, soon, we're going to see one of those examples of what happened with the exilarch, with the Reish Galuta. It led to all kinds of other problems, including the consolidation of one sect of Judaism called the Karaite, which we talked about in our very first class. If you remember, in the very first class, I started off with the topic of Chalent because it helped us to understand the idea of history and how history is very important in understanding certain modern things that we do. We're going to talk about Karaite Judaism at some point as well. So you would think with all this tumult, both within the Jewish community, within the outside forces coming into the area, into Babylonia, Persia, it's all the same place. That's not correct. Persia is Iran, Babylonia is Iraq. But in this region, that you think that they're like, oh, the leaders are falling apart and that nothing's happening, nothing's working. They actually, the sages, the great people of the time, did try, in fact, to keep things together. And they decided that they would try to consolidate their Torah academies into somewhere that's a little bit off the beaten path. And even those of you who may have heard of some of these cities we've talked about, Nerda, Pumbedita, Matamachasi, Surah, may never have heard of the city Parush Shabur. Parush Shabur, I'm sure there's other ways to pronounce it. Actually, in about the year 530-ish, meaning at the end of the time period of the redaction of the Talmud, the leaders of various communities decide to consolidate a lot of the academies into this one area for the purpose of, first, it wasn't that far from Pumbedita, which is one of the big Torah academies, so they were able to draw from there. But it was very fortified. It was not at any central junction, any central road. So, like I say, it's like they would take the yeshivot, I'm making up so you can understand perspective. You can say yeshivot from Bnei Brak, yeshivot from Yerushalayim, yeshivot from other cities, and they put it somewhere, maybe in the middle of the Judean desert, maybe somewhere between Malei Adumim down to the Dead Sea. Not as stark as that, but they tried to do that. So this way, they would be able to avoid further internal strife and the external problems that were coming upon them. That lasted for about 70 years. During that time period, something fascinating occurred in the growth of Jewish literature. I've been explaining to you in this class, the last class, the one before that, about that this time period, known as the time of the Amoraim, or the rabbis of the time of the Talmud, was the time when the Gemara was concluded, for the most part. I've also described how it was edited into topics. It was edited into what's called Masechtot, into various named books. But there was still actually two more parts that needed to be taken care of. And one was called the minor tractates, or the Masechtot Ktanot. Even people who are very familiar with Gemara may never have heard of the Masechtot Ktanot. What happened during these 70 years when there was consolidation of many students from all over Bavel into one general area? They didn't all come there, but many did. And there was a tremendous brain trust now. And they made a decision that there was actually more than had been redacted and written down already in the Talmud, that there needed to be some more. Not to the same great extent of the amount of words and pages and books, but something smaller. So let's take a look at this slide here. Okay, make this a little bigger. During this time period, they added many small masechtot to the Talmud. They are not learned in the Daf Yomi cycle, but you will find them in most printings of Gemaras. Often you'll find them at the end of the section of Nezikin. Sometimes you'll find them in a separate area, but they're there. Some are literally just one page. Some are multiple pages. I'm just going to pick out a few of them to let you understand what they are. They're called Masechtot Ktanot because it's exactly what they are. They're small tractates. In Bavli, the shortest Masechta is 14 pages, 14 amudim. 14 dapim, 14 pages. And some of these, like I said, are even much shorter than that, 2-3 pages, and some are longer. So Avot de Rabbi Natan is probably one of the most well-known because it's quoted all the time. And it's a compendium or correlation to what goes into Masechet Avot, or what we call Pirkei Avot, and it has longer Mishnayot and longer information. Masechet Sofrim, Avel Rabati, the fourth line, or whatever it is over here, right here, Avel Rabati. These have to do with halachot of burial, halachot of Avelut, Masechet Kala, which makes sense. It has to do with marriage rules. And wait a minute, you have a whole Gemara, you have Kiddushin. So there's certain practical things that were not mentioned in the Talmud that they felt there was a need to add more information, not a how-to guide, but more practical information. There's also, interestingly enough, Derech Eretz Rabbah and Derech Eretz Zutav. These are Ben Adam Lechavero type of topics, things that between man and his fellow man. If you skip down to the bottom, there's Masechet Sefer Torah, Masechet Zuzah, Masechet Tefillin, Masechet Tzitzit, which is just below the screen. These are, again, why is this important to know? Okay, you say like, okay, fine, just, you could just said, okay, look it up, or why is this important to know? Because we have to keep something in mind as we go through this moment in history, this time period in history. This is the beginning of the explosion of Jewish law. Again, up until Rabbi Yehuda Nasi finishes the Mishnah in the approximately year 200, there was nothing written down as far as official. From the year 200 on till the year 500, by the year 200, he finishes writing down the Mishnah. From about the next 300 years in Bavel, there are all these discussions and teachings, and they're being written down and finally being compiled and edited. But there's still no book of laws yet. So among the needs of day-to-day life, There's someone to know certain things that had to do with marriage and didn't want to start going through an entire Masechta of Gemara of X amount of pages, and they needed something short, then many of these halachot would be consolidated into one place. This eventually helps become part of the basis many centuries later into the Shulchan Aruch, which we'll get to. Now, take a look, please, at this next screen. Just as a kind of like, where are we right now? We started at the end of the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash. We talked, of course, which was in the year 70. We talked about the Bar Kokhba revolt. We talked a little bit about some other people, Shimon Bar Yochai. We talked about the time period of the Mishnah, which ends approximately year 200 to 220. So those people were called the Tanaim. The second group of time period, or Kufa, was the Amoraim, the time of the Talmud of the Gemara, which is about 300 years. And now we're going to come to a spot, to a topic that I will be willing to bet 95% of Jews, I'm talking about even people who know stuff, never heard of. And that's the time period of the Savoraim. One of the things I love about teaching is finding things that, first of all, I don't know, which is great, which I find literally every day, which is wonderful, but also things that people may not know of and trying to make sure they become aware of. And this is the time period known as the Savoraim. The Savoraim was a very short time period. Even though I have here about 110 years, there are some opinions it was about 40 years. Some say it was 2 generations, 3 generations, up to 5 generations. There is no exact number, but the fact that it was short, the fact that most people don't know what they did, is one of the reasons, is among the reasons why people never heard of them. Many people heard of the Tanaim and the Amoraim. They heard of the time of the Talmud and the Mishnah. The Savoraim, no. The next generation, which goes a few hundred years, is the Gaonim. Those I'm sure many of you heard of, which we're going to hear about those people and this time period. What was different about their generation than what's going on in the time of the Savoraim? So first of all, what did they do? Okay, I'm going to read and translate this this piece, this very short thing, which explains in general what they did, as far as like the tachlis, what was their activity. But there was a lot more, which we'll talk about, that they actually did for the Jewish people, which makes this such a critical time period. I think it's important before we go on to make sure it's very clear in everyone's head. We went from the time of the Mishnah, that leads us into the time of the Gemara. The time of the Gemara then leads us into this little teeny window of the Savoraim, which gets us to leapfrog then, that's not the right term, to bridge into the next major time period of a few hundred years of the Gaonim. So this little tiny bridge here is what's going to help us get there. But let's see what they did. First from this comment here from Rav Shri Gaon, who's the Gaonic period after the Savoraim. And then we'll go back into talking a little bit about more what they did with the community. More than most of the additions that the Savoraim made, when they talk about additions, we're talking about additions to the Talmud. Now wait, didn't we say that Ravina and Rav Ashi edited the Talmud? Well, the answer is yes. But even after something's been edited, and especially a massive work like this, there was still work that needed to be done. And that became part of the work of the next generation or two, called the Savoraim. What did they did? They did tremendous amount of work still on the Talmud. What did they do? They finished the order, the actual order of the Masechtot. It's even written, if you look at Masechet Megillah, you will find it discusses, why is this Masechta in this order? Why is this in this order? Why does this follow this? Why does this come before that? So that's mentioned already in the Gemara, more than likely inserted by the Savoraim themselves. It says they completed the order, meaning the actual order of the books. They concluded them, and Masru lanu betavnito ubetzurato kfi shu matzui biadenu, and they handed it over to us, so to speak, into the shape and form that we now know to this day. Anywhere you go in the world, you say that you're learning Daf Mem Amud Bet, which means page 40, side 2 in Masechet Ketubot, it's going to always be the same thing. That concept, even though, like I said, the way we see a page of Gemara today was really in the 1700s in Achim Ram, late 1700s, early 1800s actually. It was Achim Ram, 1800s. But the idea of the Masechto from what's there, this comes all the way back to this time period. Rav Shvi Ragon Ba'igarato Amar Ki Rabbanan Savurai Have Mefarshe V'Choma Dahabet Tali V'Kai Tershuha. I'm going to read the next couple lines and I'll go back and translate. Mikan Shebachol Makom Shenitza B'Shas Ke'en Perush LeMachloket Amorayim O Siyum Dvarim Rabbanan Savurai Hu. He says, what another thing that they did, you will find throughout the Gemara various expressions, as in you'll see in the next line in quotes. The hilchata and the halacha is. I'll give you one classic example that it was the discussion and the machloket, the dispute goes through maybe 1 page or 2 pages or 3 pages long, and the original discussion doesn't come to a conclusion. We don't know who's right. What is the halacha? So that when the Gemara says the hilchata and halacha is, almost always, says Rav Shvi Ragon, people from this time period, post-Talmudic time period, wrote into there, this is the halacha. One of the most famous ones you can think of has to do with 2 men named Rava and Abaye. They had a machloket, immaterial, if you know what this means or not, because it's not important at the moment. Something called Yeo Shalom Da'at, if it's considered Yeush or not. Again, I might be speaking Chinese to many of you, but Rava said one thing and Abaye said one thing, and they go on for 2.5 pages going back and forth. One proves his point, he proves his point, he proves his point, and at the end it says v'hilchata Abaye yal pigam, whatever. Again, what is this v'hilchata? Or the next expression you'll see here, otve kolhani tiyufte v'shani lekidushanina. They've had all these questions and these subjects have been discussed, and it is when we teach as is taught. What does that mean? Again, it's another expression used that the Gemara comes up with a decision. So when you open a Gemara and you look at this, and you come to a moment where the Gemara says, the hilchata kis so-and-so, the halacha goes like so-and-so, you can understand that almost always it meant that when the Gemara Talmud was finished being edited, it wasn't there originally, and the Savoraim then added that in, so it would be made more of a final product for future generations. Od ne'emar b'seder Tanaim v'Amorai, sherabanan Savorai tiknu seder sugiyot ha'Gemara lefi seder ha'Mishnah. They also did lefi seder ha'Pirkeha. When you look at Gemara, it's organized very often. What's called a sugiyah. Sugiyah is a topic. Topic could be the idea of muktzah, for example. So the topic of muktzah you would assume, if it is in Masechet Shabbat. And the whole discussion there, is there such a thing as muktzah? Is it minat Torah? Is it the rabbis made the concept of muktzah? And they would compile some of the information from different discussions in different areas and put it in one place, and then make another discussion that came after to have something to do with that. The order, the actual flow, a lot of the flow of the Gemara is again attributed to this time of the Savoraim. So it would be a very big mistake to think that when they finished the Gemara, it was a finished 100% done job. It wasn't. It was vast majority was done, but then it was left to this very brief time period of the Savoraim to help us get to what we have today. Okay, that's the Torah aspect of it. What about the day-to-day life? What were the Savoraim doing? How were they involved in community? So this was also a very difficult time. It's like you almost open up any Jewish history book and just randomly choose a year. It's a difficult time for the Jews. Each generation with its own difficulty. But during this time, again, approximately the year 520, 530 for, again, who knows, 40 years, 50 years, 75 years. It's not important. What is important is that we know that there's this time period known as the Savoraim. They are helping to be in charge of Klal Yisrael, of the Jewish people in the diaspora. They give a lot of support. I'm not talking about financial support. I'm talking about emotional and spiritual support. You will often find in Jewish history that there are rough patches. We're going through a rough patch right now. We're going through a very rough patch right now. And let's not talk about today. Let's talk about well, the time period of Spain in the 1400s, or England in the 1200s, or go back to this time period now with the ascension, the decline of Persia and some bad guys trying to go into against them, and the internal disagreements they having to do with the Karaites and all. So it was a very tough time, especially not just physically, but spiritually. So what's been over the centuries, you find that the leaders of those communities, whether it's the Rosh Yeshiva, whether it's the exilarch or it's someone of that nature. In this case, it was the Savoraim, carry the community and carry the people on their shoulders in a figurative way to try to lift them up from what was a crisis of faith for some of them. Part of the other problem with what's happening at this point is we cannot forget that Christianity is getting much stronger already by this point. Christianity, the first couple hundred years, is not a major attack on Judaism, a little less than the first couple hundred years, because we saw that by the time of Bar Kokhba revolt, one of the things that became a more defined split among the Jews and the Christians happened after that, which was in 135. But now, about 300-400 years later, things are getting even worse, and it will get much worse. We know that. And in this background, the Savoraim are coming in to try to keep the Jewish community solid and keep them focused and not to be assimilated into other peoples. One of the crises the Jews are going through at that time will be replicated centuries later by Tsar Nicholas, where in Russia, where Jewish children are kidnapped, handed over to, in this case, Persian priests, and then raised for religious education. You know, there are unfortunately many stories of whether it's in World War II and other times when Jewish children were kidnapped, literally as babies or very, very little kids, and they're brought to a Christian convent and wherever it might be, and raised as Catholic or raised in another religion or completely without religion. And that happens actually for a short period of time also during this time period of the Savoraim. And it was necessary for the Savoraim to do something to not only help try to get these children, but also in order to deal with the parents. Again, think about it, how we say history always repeats itself. We have children right now who are captive. It's not for religious reasons, it's for other reasons. And we have parents that we're trying to help. By the way, I saw a few people forwarded to me a very nice video for Tanit Esther tomorrow. You have multiple, like goes from one screen to the next of different parents saying tomorrow's Tanit Noah, tomorrow's Tanit Rafi, or whoever, naming all the people, many of the hostages, that we should have them in mind. In addition to that, I would be remiss if I didn't mention also tomorrow at 5:30 our time, there'll be a worldwide Shema Yisrael. Tomorrow at 4:30 to 5:30 at the Kotel, and it's a worldwide attempt to have everyone in the world as much as possible to say Shema Yisrael tomorrow at 5:30 Israel time. Again, what is that for? What's that for? Again, it's the idea of trying to give us some hope, give us more hope, turning to God as well. And that's what the Savoraim tried to do as well during this time period. Unfortunately, during this time period also, Jews started to wander away from this center of Torah, from the Jewish community, started to wander away, tried to leave, and did leave Babylonia completely, and set up shop in other countries as a result of religious persecution. In many cases, it was because of religious persecution. They emigrated from Babylonia, and in many cases, end up getting closer to what we would call today modern-day Europe. It wasn't Europe, it was, but it wasn't how we know it, obviously, which becomes the initial seeds of European Jewry being dropped in different places. Remember, we're only talking approximately the year 600 now. So this is way before what we would know as, quote, modern European history, maybe in the 13th century, 14th century. So it's hundreds of years before these seeds are already planted. But the problem becomes that the Jews who left one area of the diaspora went to seek shelter in another area of the diaspora, didn't find much better lives at that point, because many of the people, as a matter of fact, not only that were subject to more persecution, but because of that, there was more assimilation, and in many cases we lost the chain of many families because of that. There was no prophet. We know that prophecy ends in the middle of, not even the middle, early on at the time of the second Beit HaMikdash. We know that Malachi was the end of prophecy. So we didn't have any prophets. There was no real way to divine what God wanted from the people. I said, well, about going to Israel, but making Aliyah. That was not an option at this moment. Things are also bad. There wasn't a lot of base of Jewish life there, even though there was the Talmud that had been finished already, even though there were Jews living there. But life in Babylonia was definitely, for the religious Jew, was much better at this time until things start to fall apart than it was in Israel. But it doesn't seem like there was any real attempt to stop the Jews from emigrating, from leaving Babylonia. The Savarim worked with them to try, while they were there, to try to make things calm and to try to bring peace to them and to help the parents whose children had been kidnapped and other things. But there did not seem to be too much attention on the Jews leaving. And not only that, it turned out that many of the prominent Chachamim, the prominent sages, actually emigrated as well. So now you've had many people leaving. You've had many of the Chachamim leaving as well. And again, I repeat myself that these become the early seeds being planted for the future of what will become European Jewry. There was an event that happened that brought an end during this time, also the time of Savoraim, an end to the whole institution of the Resh Galuta, or the exile. And there had been a machloket, that had been a dispute about something. It's not important at the moment what it was. Just shortly after this big dispute, the Resh Galuta died. And the Resh Galuta, his son, was named Mar Zutra the fifth. There's the fifth man who was named Mar Zutra. It's not the Mar Zutra we see in the Gemara. He was the son, and he was all of 15 years old, and he was appointed to be the Resh Galuta. And as you can imagine, someone who's at that age was probably not respected as much as he should have been. But he rules is not the right word. He serves for 13 years. And at the age of 28, I'm actually going to read to you. I came across an article and read to you. It's just 10 or 12 lines. When he was 28 years old and already broken in spirit, the result of the calamities caused by the devastated condition of the land and their effect upon him, Mar Zutra took steps to implement an odd and inexplicable idea which he had conceived. Imagining that by doing so, he would be able to retain his position, he prepared to make himself ruler over an autonomous area. Though perhaps he really had no choice, for he saw his plan as a solution to the ravages being wreaked upon the Jewish community by rulers of the expiring Persian Empire. In the end, his plan fell apart. Notice, he was trying to carve out a land that he would be like, we have Judaism, this is it, we are autonomous. The whole plan fell apart, and he was defeated by the Persians. Mar Zutra was taken prisoner by them, together with his grandfather, who had been the instigator behind the petty dispute over the appointment of the Dayan, which was the whole case that the Resh Galut ended up dying from, which he had destroyed the tranquility of the family. And both of them were hung on a bridge located in Mechoza. It was the famous city of Torah, and that ended that area of what was happening. That ended the office of the Resh Galuta. Why is that important to know? Because we had a wonderful setup. It ended it in de facto, but de jure, like in legal terms, there still was something left. The Persian government recognized that the Jews there needed to be some go-between between the Persian government and the Jewish people. And they still needed some way of communicating back and forth, whether it was the taxation, it was the laws, it was whatever it might be. So they did allow a semi-autonomous existence, that there were people within the community that helped to run this, but there was no longer the office of the Resh Galuta. Peace is finally returned to the area. And once again, the famed yeshiva of Pumbedita opens its doors. And a lot of things happened in this time period. that led to the end of many of these Talmudic academies, which afterwards will lead into the next major time period of approximately 500 years, known as the Gaonim, which we're not going to start tonight. So just to recap, Mishnah period, Gemara period, Savoraim. Okay, again, why are we focusing so much on the books and what about the stories? What about the things that happen, like major events? There are. You can, if you want to be bored out of your mind, you can always go on and find many of them. But as far as the things that we need to understand to be the building blocks to when we're going to get to the approximately year 1000 and really start taking off from there, we need all these building blocks. It'll take a few weeks till we get to that. And that the next time period, the time of the Gaonim, will be we'll see a sea change when it comes to how Jews related to each other in the world of Torah, in the world of commerce, and the fact that now the Jews are spread out much further than they ever were before. For the most part, before these time periods, they were all in Israel, or they were in Israel and Babylon. Now we know they've left Babylon, they're traveling and getting into what we call Europe, and we have a lot more spread out. How are they going to do this? And I don't mean be facetious at all when I say this. It's not, we have communication. They didn't have communication like we have today. They didn't have internet. They didn't have WhatsApp. They didn't have any way to communicate other than the written word. And that's going to end up becoming another major milestone in Jewish history about how these communications took place between the rabbis of the time and the people who needed to know what to do. We'll pick it up Bezrat Hashem next week. Again, next week, one more time on Wednesday. For the last time, hopefully we'll go back to Tuesdays and pick it up at the time of the Gaonim. As always, should you have any questions, any follow-up, any complaints, send me a message and we'll deal with it. If it's something I think we go bring to the class, I will do that as well. Have a good night and have a Purim Sameach to everybody.